It's very easy to take Star Wars for granted. I'm not talking about the intense saturation of the brand in modern media, or the rapid intensity of the fandom, but more simply, the ubiquity Star Wars holds within pop culture. Most of us born after the original trilogy have grown up in a world where Star Wars has always existed, where concepts like the Force or lightsabers or Yoda were as familiar as baseball, Superman, and apple pie. And the shared knowledge and understanding of specific details is not the sole domain of fans. You probably have to be some degree of nerd to know the TIE and TIE Fighter stands for Twin Ion Engine, but even folks who don't really watch the movies tend to know that the Death Star is a giant space station which blows up planets, or can distinguish between a Wookiee and an Ewok. It's a testament to the world building of these films that so many geeky sci-fi concepts have resonated so profoundly with a wide audience. You could make similar praise of franchises like Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, but it's worth noting both rely on a shared fantasy iconography, with creatures and magic which appear throughout the genre. Wizards exist across all manner of fantasy stories. Jedi only exist in one. It's not easy to make a story about evil galactic empires and weirdo warrior monks accessible for a wide audience. If you don't believe me, just ask David Lynch. Dune is part of the wave of sci-fi and fantasy movies to come in the 1980s, inspired by the success of George Lucas's space opera. I wouldn't call it the worst film to aspire to be the next Star Wars, but its failure is perhaps the most spectacular. A massive flop which Lynch himself has disowned, the consensus among critics in 1984 was that the film was nearly incomprehensible to anyone unfamiliar with the source material. Roger Ebert really summed up the overall reaction to Dune best, writing, "This movie is a real mess, an incomprehensible, ugly, unstructured, pointless excursion into the murkier realms of one of the most confusing screenplays of all time. But what fascinates me is the basic storytelling elements are largely shared with Star Wars. Both films involve a young man who becomes a great warrior by fighting alongside his friends against an evil empire. Both are largely set on harsh desert planets, both deal in quasi-spiritual factions and concepts.
There's no need to fight over me.
You don't need to see his identification.
Indeed, Lucas was almost certainly inspired by Frank Herbert's original novel, and drew on those concepts when conceiving his own galaxy far, far away. Yet the actual film adaptation of Dune failed to translate the details of its world to audiences. So I want to take a closer look at both movies, David Lynch's Dune and the original Star Wars, to understand how each film introduces its sci-fi worlds, and try to pinpoint where one film thrived and another stumbled. But before I start talking about the ins and outs of Landsrid politics or the efficacy of Tosche Station's power converters, let's talk about today's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes in all manner of subjects, available to anyone interested in expanding their knowledge and learning something new. And it just so happens that there's a perfect class to complement this video, Lincoln Michel's Science Fiction and Fantasy, Creating Unique and Powerful Worlds. Lincoln is a professor of fiction and an author who specializes in short stories of all manner. This class is specifically focused on world building in sci-fi and fantasy writing, with materials aimed at beginning writers, but the tactics still useful for seasoned pros. The overarching goal of the class is to develop big ideas, but execute with the precision to make for digestible storytelling, and Lincoln approaches lessons with expertise and an infectious passion for writing. Skillshare is also ad-free, and the first 1,000 people who click the link in the description will get a free 1-month trial of Skillshare's premium membership. Whether you're a pro looking to sharpen your skills, or a novice striking up a new hobby, Skillshare has got you covered.
I'm afraid we need to use math.
My first task in comparing Dune and Star Wars was to compile a list of all the weird sci-fi concepts introduced by each movie. A link to the full charts can be found in the video description, but the main things I was looking for were fictional locations, concepts, and creatures. Examples of things listed include things like Arrakis, the Death Star, the Force, and Mentats. Characters were a bit of a gray zone, but my general rule of thumb was to consider if the names sounded weird or alien. So characters like Luke or Paul didn't qualify, but characters like Thufir or Grand Moff Tarkin did. After compiling my list, I counted 51 unique sci-fi details in Star Wars and 57 in Dune. Initial conclusions then suggest that both films throw a similar amount of foreign concepts at their audience. Dune does have more, but ultimately a negligible amount, especially considering the film is about 15 minutes longer than Star Wars. The issue isn't in the volume of world-building details, but the execution. How do Lynch and Lucas introduce their science fiction?
Well, Omicron Persei 8 is about 1,000 light years away, so the electromagnetic waves would just recently have gotten there. You see, magic. Got it.
Both Dune and Star Wars open on large exposition dumps, which bring the audience up to speed on the basics of their universe. Star Wars has the iconic opening crawl, Dune has a character from the story make a direct address to the camera. And already from the exposition, it is clear that Dune's world building will be much more overwhelming. We are told in the scene the following. The year is 10,191. The universe is ruled by the Badashi Emperor Shaddam IV. That the Emperor is...
my father.
So she must be important. That spice melange is the most precious commodity in the universe, used for expanding consciousness and space travel, that the Spacing Guild has been mutated by the spice for 4,000 years, that the spice only exists on one planet, that the people on this planet are called Fremen, that the Fremen have a prophecy of a messiah who will lead them to freedom, and that the planet is called Arrakis, aka... Star Wars, meanwhile, is a lot more stripped down. There is a civil war between the Rebellion and the Galactic Empire, the Rebels have a hidden base, the Rebels have stolen plans for the Empire's ultimate weapon, the Death Star can destroy planets, and that Princess Leia is bringing the plans to her home to save her people and restore freedom. The most striking difference is in the details. Star Wars keeps things pretty simple. There are good guys and bad guys. The bad guys have a super weapon that can blow up planets, the good guys have stolen plans for that weapon and want to stop them. Lucas even removes all ambiguity about who the villains are when he clarifies the evil Galactic Empire, as opposed to those benevolent Galactic Empires that just want to chill. Dune's prologue, on the other hand, is a minefield of loosely connected information we're meant to keep track of. We get two different factions in the Fremen and the Spacing Guild, a strange substance which functions as both mind-expanding drug and source of interstellar travel, the planet it comes from, and an emperor who rules over everything. There's more detail in things like names and time frame, yet less clarity in terms of motivation and intent. You could sort of infer that the Fremen and the Spacing Guild are in some sort of conflict over the spice and the exploitation of Fremen land, but that isn't actually made clear, nor is either side's relationship to the Badashi Emperor. Not that we necessarily need all those details mapped out in the opening, but Lynch still insists on giving us the pieces without a sense of how they connect. The only clear takeaway from the prologue is the importance of spice, its uses, and the fact that it can only be found on the planet Arrakis. Adding so much extra information about what year we're in and the Fremen and their vague prophecy this early in the film just muddies the waters. You'll notice that Star Wars' crawl makes no reference to the Force or the Jedi or even Tatooine. We're only given information that is immediately necessary.
Oh yes. I forgot to tell you.
I think the scene's overly complicated nature is best embodied by the choice of narrator. This, we later learn, is Princess Urulan, and her presence here suggests she must be some major part of the story. But she isn't at all. She shows up in a couple scenes in the Emperor's throne room, but is essentially a background extra who could be pretty easily cut from the film. I know each chapter of the novel begins with an epigraph from Urulan, which sheds some light on the larger world, but in the context of this intro, her appearance is just another unnecessary detail. Star Wars, meanwhile, is lean and focused. Within the first 30 seconds, the film has already established the two MacGuffins which will propel the story: the stolen Death Star plans and the hidden Rebel base. The very same factors at the core of the climactic trench run. Even when giving exposition, Star Wars is still telling a story. Dune's prologue, on the other hand, is just a big exposition dump. It's a summary of information without the storytelling which makes those details worth knowing in the first place.
Wow! The interesting thing about that is...
Following the initial setup, each movie's story begins proper in the opening scene, and it's here where Dune and Star Wars start to really diverge. While Star Wars transitions into an exciting action scene where the stormtroopers siege and wage war on a spaceship, Dune has yet another exposition dump, as a secret report from the Spacing Guild highlights the 4 key planets of the film: Arrakis, Caladan, Geta Prime, Chiton, and explains their main significance. The Guild also mentions a mysterious plot to jeopardize spice production, which eventually transitions into the film's third scene, a meeting between the Guild and the Emperor to discuss Duke Leto of House Atreides and the potential threat he and planet Caladan pose. It's tempting to say Star Wars' opening is light and fun, where Dune's is heavy and overbearing, but there's a deeper difference. More than just offering a blast of excitement, the battle in Star Wars lets the audience begin to take in the story on an emotional level. The opening text scroll told us that the Empire are evil and a danger to the rebellion, and now we actually get to experience that evil and danger firsthand. We feel the stakes. Lucas uses several close-ups of frightened rebels awaiting the attack, prompting viewer identification with them and not the static and menacing faces of the stormtrooper helmets. Dune's opening scene, on the other hand, doesn't encourage any specific feelings. It's just more information to absorb. The actual story doesn't really begin to develop until the third scene, when the Emperor and the Guild Navigator begin to discuss what's to be done about this Paul Atreides, son of Duke Leto, and even then, only after the film has introduced more concepts and places.
I am your truthsayer, my lord.
An Gesserit witch.
And therein lies the core difference between movies. Dune almost never stops expositing. Even moments of silence are interrupted by characters' internal monologue explaining what is happening.
Why would they want the Duke's son killed?
I know she has come to test him. No man has ever been tested with the box. Tonight, I may lose my son.
Kwisatz Haderach, the super being. With a father, nothing.
Star Wars is much more precise. In fact, there isn't really another exposition dump after the opening crawl until about the 30-minute mark, when Obi-Wan explains to Luke about the Jedi. It might sound like the movie which is constantly explaining itself would make a lot more sense, but in fact the opposite is true. In Star Wars, the world building is at the service of the story and characters. The audience doesn't need constant exposition because our understanding of the people and their motivations is at the forefront. The exposition in Obi-Wan's hut, for example, is the first time we're introduced to concepts like the Force and the Jedi. They aren't part of the crawl or mentioned offhandedly by Vader or anybody else before this point because they aren't yet relevant to the audience. Instead, the focus is on the conflict between the Empire and the Rebellion, along with Luke's frustration and yearning for more in life. Lucas allows the audience to breathe and take in the story emotionally, to the point that when another big exposition dump does come around, we're ready for it. Dune's constant explaining doesn't allow for this. Before we've even had a proper scene, we're expected to keep track of 4 planets, 5 factions, 2 characters, and the key concept of spice and its implications. And no matter how many times the film explains that the Harkonnens of Geta Prime are the enemies of the Atreides of Caladan, that information just doesn't stick without a visceral or emotional connection.
If we can reroute engine power through the primary weapons and reconfigure them to Melvar's frequency, that should overload his electro-quantum structure.
Like putting too much air in a balloon!
All movies use context and shorthand as a way to relay complex ideas to an audience quickly and efficiently, and this is especially crucial when working in sci-fi or fantasy stories. No one before 1977 might have known what a Jedi is, but before Obi-Wan tells us, Uncle Owen describes him as a wizard.
That wizard's just a crazy old man.
The shared cultural understanding of wizard is used here as shorthand. The term evokes wise old men who use magic and guide the hero through their journey. It cues us to who Obi-Wan is and his role in the story. We've already begun to understand the Jedi before even hearing the term. Dune, to its credit, does this successfully too.
The Bene Gesserit witch must leave.
Okay, I don't know what a Bene Gesserit is, but witch makes me think of secretive covens of women who plot and scheme to control behind the scenes, while using their magic to influence outcomes in their favor. The essence of the Bene Gesserit is explained without the film actually having to exposit on the matter. Where Dune is less successful is in the context of its terms and concepts. Sci-fi and fantasy stories will often have characters casually mention fictional ideas without explaining them, but in a context which makes the intent clear. Prime example, I'll probably never know what going to Tosche Station to pick up power converters looks like, but the context of the scene is clear. Luke wants to go out and have fun with his friends, but he has to do chores. You don't need to understand Tosche Station to understand the point of the scene. It hints at a larger world while keeping the story and character in focus. Dune struggles with this. I'm thinking in particular of when the Emperor describes Duke Leto as becoming more popular in the Landsrid.
The Duke is becoming more popular in the Landsrid. He could threaten me.
And my first thought was, what's the Landsrid? I kind of assumed it referred to a specific region on either Caladan or Arrakis, or maybe a certain solar system, but according to the Dune fan wiki, the Landsrid was the body that represented all the great houses during the days of the Imperium. It was ruled by the High Council and overseen by the Padasha Emperor. Okay, so it's kind of like the Senate, a political body which met to discuss policy and governance. The problem is that intent isn't clear in the scene, which makes the implication of Duke Leto's growing popularity confusing. Gaining support in a Senate, for example, is different from gaining support from the locals on either Arrakis or Caladan, or in a neighboring solar system which might be considering lending military aid. A simple reference to the politicians or bureaucracy would help clarify the Landsrid as a political body and therefore why Leto's popularity matters and what its implications are.
The blurns are loaded, the Count's 3 blurns and 2 anti-blurns, and the infield blurn rule is in effect, right?
Except for the word blurn, that was complete gibberish.
I've talked a lot about how Star Wars prioritizes story and character above world building, but I also want to make clear that not every detail of a film's universe should be about propelling the plot. One of the great thrills of fictional settings are the implications of the world beyond. The trick is that the audience always be clear on which details are essential to the story and which are mere flavor. George Lucas does this masterfully. Beyond stray references to the Junlan Wastes or the spice mines of Kessel, or the aforementioned Tosche Station, which are thrown off casually but immediately clear in context, the best example is the Clone Wars.
You fought in the Clone Wars?
This is a term that has a very different meaning in 2021 than in 1977, but remember that 40 plus years ago, no one knew what the hell the Clone Wars were. I doubt Lucas even knew. It's clear from the way Luke and Obi-Wan talk that it must have been a pretty important conflict, but it is equally clear that the details of said war don't matter to this specific story. The focus of conversation is not the Clone Wars themselves, but that Obi-Wan fought in them a long time ago, reinforcing his status as an aging warrior. And perhaps more essentially, that Luke's father also fought in the Clone Wars, implying that the call to adventure and fighting against injustice are in his very blood. We learn about the supporting character, and the protagonist's journey is furthered. The other crucial factor is that by the time the Clone Wars are introduced, the film has already made clear its protagonist and central conflict. That is to say, the viewer understands what is important in the story, and all new information can be interpreted through that lens. Let's compare that to Dune and the Guild Navigator's references to Ix and Richies.
We have just folded space from Ix. Many machines on Ix. Better than those on Riches.
This is one of the first things the Guild Navigator says to the Emperor in the third scene of the film, and immediately prompts questions of, what the hell does that mean?
What the fuck is that?
I correctly intuited that Ix and Richies are different planets, but why do they matter? What is the significance of the machines found there? This information is treated with seriousness and intrigue by both parties, but is then just dropped and never comes back again. And at this point in the movie, the audience is still looking for something to hold on to. The protagonist hasn't been revealed yet, the central conflict is still vague and ill-defined. All we really have to latch onto is a bunch of disparate lore. Without any sort of grounding, it's never clear if new elements are crucial.
The powerful Bene Gesserit sisterhood for 90 generations has been manipulating bloodlines to produce the Kwisatz Haderach.
Or just flavor.
It is by will alone I set my mind in motion. It is by the juice of Safu that thoughts acquire speed, the lips acquire stains, the stains become a warning. It is by will alone I set my mind in motion.
Let's recap what's happened so far.
Looking at both these films in tandem, I think the key which makes Star Wars' world building so successful is its restraint. Much as it feels like the movie is overflowing with alien creatures and technology and a whole galaxy of possibility, Lucas rarely gives us any more than what is necessary. Case in point, my chart mentions things like Tatooine, Tantive 4, X-Wings, and TIE Fighters. All familiar terms for Star Wars fans, and not a single one is actually used in the movie. As far as audiences in 1977 were concerned, this wasn't Tatooine. It was just the desert planet Luke came from. Knowing the name is less important than simply understanding the setting. There's enough detail to spark one's imagination, but not so much that we lose sight of the story. Dune, on the other hand, is so awash with detail that the overall effect is disorienting, as if the film itself were an alien being.
I will kill you.
To some, that might just sound like classic David Lynch. The man does specialize in bewildering stories which are hard to make logical sense of, but his work usually has a strong emotional core. The anxiety of growing up, the loss of innocence, the disillusion of dreams, the inability to return to the past. I might not literally understand the ending of Twin Peaks, but I know how it made me feel. Dune lacks emotional clarity, which proves its greatest failing. For all its visual imagination, or grand music, or creative casting choices, the most basic storytelling fundamentals are lost. And I do think that helps put the accomplishments of Star Wars into perspective. George Lucas may not have built the most in-depth or detailed fictional universe, but he understood the real magic was getting the audience to care about his make-believe in the first place.